A very good morning to all of you, and I'm hoping you're well, and I'm hoping you can hear the guinea fowl in the background there. Today we're going to be having a look at 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and from verse 8. 2 Corinthians chapter 1 from verse 8. This past week I read a summary of the emotional price which people, including Christians, are paying during the COVID pandemic. And the quote goes, "The disease itself, multiplied by forced quarantine, applied by nationwide lockdowns, can produce acute panic, anxiety, obsessive behaviors, hoarding, paranoia, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder in the long run." Fueled by social media, outbursts of racism, stigmatization, and xenophobia against particular communities are also being widely reported. And I found that helpful inasmuch as it is an explanation for both the emotional turmoil many of us are in, and as a partial explanation for the surge of racism, for example, in South Africa over the past several months. Now, Paul wasn't living at a time of such a pandemic, but he was certainly living through something which caused him severe emotional anguish, and about which he wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 8 through 11, where he effectively describes the emotional suffering of the saints. The emotional suffering of the saints. Saints, born-again believers like Paul and like the progenitor of the saints, the Lord Jesus Christ, did suffer emotional anguish. Now, by acknowledging this reality and by examining Paul's experience, hopefully we can gain some sort of understanding of what Paul went through and how he was able to come through it in the end. The first part of Paul's account involves the public acknowledgement of the anguish. The public acknowledgement of the anguish. In the first half of verse 8, we read, "We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about the hardships we suffered in the province of Asia." Paul wants, in part, for the Corinthian Christians to be informed of the hardships he suffered in Asia, today's Turkey. He does so initially for a fairly mundane reason, and that is to provide the Corinthians with an explanation of why he didn't visit them as he had promised that he would. And that's spoken about in verses 16 and 17, where we read, "I planned to visit you on my way to Macedonia and to come back to you from Macedonia, and then to have you send me on my way to Judea." When I planned this, did I do it in a worldly manner, so that in the same breath I say yes, yes, and no, no? Simply put, Paul wants the Corinthian Christians to understand why he wasn't able to keep his word about visiting them. He wasn't able to keep his word because of this episode of emotional suffering. Now, that should be music in our ears as Christians, since many of us have had fellow Christians promise us things like, "I'll phone you, I'll come and see you, I'll speak to my accountant about your problem," and they have not only not done it, but they have also never referred to their unkept promises again. Our promises as Christians are our word as Christians, and others should be able to rely on us keeping our word. Paul explains why he wasn't able to keep his word, and it was because of the hardships we suffered in the province of Asia. The cause of the hardships are not defined, and some scholars speculate that Paul was ill, while others say that it had something to do with him being persecuted. Tasker concludes that in the absence of any precise information, a form of persecution due to mob violence somewhere in Asia, but not necessarily at Ephesus, is probably the best conjecture we can make. Whatever the reason for Paul being unable to keep his word, what we do know is that he suffered hardship. The word hardship there can be translated as affliction, distress, or persecution, and it means to experience severe internal pressure that causes someone to feel trapped, restricted without options of escape. This is all about profound internal and emotional pressure from which we feel there is no way of escape. And as a synonym, it occurs to me the fact that lockdown would be a comparative expression, since most people I know felt totally trapped in our homes, and we knew that we could do nothing about it. For the first time in many of our lives, we could not do anything other than stay locked up. Now, there is a real lesson for us here. Paul demonstrates that he is humble enough and comfortable enough in himself that he has no problems in letting other Christians know how he was feeling and how he was struggling. By way of contrast, many of us as Christians tend to be those who wouldn't share what is going on in our inner beings if it were the last thing on earth. Now, whilst God doesn't intend that we should be whingers who tell everyone all the time just how bad it is for us, but what He has done is given us other people, especially Christians that we can trust, just so that we can share our anguish with them. Now, Jesus did this very thing in the Garden of Gethsemane in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 38, where we read that He said to them, Peter, James, and John, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me," which they didn't do, of course. But we have here the Son of Man sharing His agony and His need for companionship with His disciples. Those disciples, we know, didn't exactly help Jesus since they fell asleep. But we really do need other people to share our anguish with as part of the way to endure in our anguish. The second part of Paul's account describes the process of the endured anguish. The process of the endured anguish. In the second half of verse 8 we read, "We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired even of life. Indeed, in our hearts we felt the sentence of death." This is the cauldron of suffering which Paul describes and speaks of the fact that he, and perhaps those with him, were under great pressure. That word pressure there is used of an ox being overloaded with the weight of a load which it could not possibly carry. And it speaks of an inner mental and emotional oppression which was so intense and so painful that they could not endure it. So intense was the horror of the experience that it was beyond their human power to endure it. It was such intense emotional pain that it caused them to be in total despair, since there was no way out. More than that, so painful was the experience that Paul reached the point of concluding that he was going to die. The expression "we despaired of life" means to lose all hope of deliverance, which is accentuated when Paul reached the place where he felt the sentence of death. Paul, like a convict who had received the death penalty, concluded that he was definitely going to die physically. And all this was nothing necessarily to do with physical causes, but the unbearable agony of emotional pain. Paul was literally finished. Now, I know that there will be those who are listening to this who have experienced exactly the same thing. You have, for example, been in the place of the sickening hopelessness as a result of a deep depression, or being in the depressive phase of a manic depressive illness, that you know that you are going to die. Alternatively, you may also have been in such pain and so dark has been your inner world that you actually want to die. Now, again, there is a real lesson for us here as Christians. The truth is that Christians, real Christians, are subject, like the rest of the human race, who do endure this impossible to bear emotional pain. Any theology which denies that fact is false. Moreover, if or when we reach this place of horror, it is important that we understand that it has nothing whatsoever to do with a lack of faith. Paul could hardly be described as a man of little faith. He tells us in his own words that he was so distraught by his emotional pain that he was convinced that he was going to die. Again, Jesus reached that point as he wrestled within himself about having to go to the cross. In Matthew 26, verse 38 again, he says, "My soul, my inner being, is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." This is not a reference to the death on the cross which awaited him, but to his inner struggle of his impossibility to continue facing the prospect of the cross. Now we need some clarification here. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13, Paul, writing to the same Christians, says, "No temptation has seized you except that which is common to man. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can stand up under it." The impossibility of Paul to endure emotional suffering of such intensity that he caved in and concluded that he was going to die is not the same thing as being tempted and being promised by God that it is possible to resist the temptation and not give in to it. God promises that he will provide us with a way out of temptation such that we will not give in to sin, and has everything to do with God's hatred of sin. As James 1:13 puts it, "When tempted, no one should say, 'God is tempting me.' For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when, by his own evil desire, he is dragged away and enticed by Satan. Then, after the desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death." The conviction that he was dying came to Paul as he suffered such intense emotional pain concerning the limitations we are all subject to as human beings.